family. Episode number 50. His grace is sufficient. This is the 50th video, and I just think that this is a milestone moment. I want to send a special thank you out to the group of followers that I know that are consistently watching and listening. I really want to say thank you. It's the audience is humbling and encouraging at the same time, because the feedback that I get from some of the people that are watching is just really encouraging. It forces me to dig more and study more. So I'm growing in grace and in the knowledge of Jesus Christ, just like you. And I'm just going to keep this going. The impact that is having on people is very humbling. It's very humbling. And somebody close to me, my cousin, says to me, he said, like, "Cuz, you starting good trouble." So I just hope that these teachings are just bringing just clarity and understanding to the scriptures and to the understanding of this amazing grace. So His grace is sufficient. Let's jump right to it. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. I'm going to be reading from the NLT. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10 in the NLT. I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God. So to keep me from being proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from being proud. So right away in this chapter here, just the context around my grace is sufficient. That was Jesus' response to Paul saying that there was a messenger from Satan, but what he's talking about is there was someone following him around when he was going to preach, and the person was like praising Paul and pushing up Paul and not the substance of what he was preaching and teaching, rather just putting the emphasis and focus on Paul. And Paul called this man a messenger of Satan, because you got to remember, Paul went through this transition from Saul to Paul. The name Paul actually means small and humble. And Paul knew the type of person that he was before he met Christ. And he doesn't see himself as somebody that's special or better than anybody. So he's just a vessel. And this is something that we need to apply to the church, and I think in the current day. Thank God for our pastors and leaders, and especially for the celebrities that we have in Christ, in our pulpits. But we need more of an emphasis on the substance of what is being taught and what people are hearing, versus just being attached to some name or to some man of God or to some church. That stuff can turn into something dangerous. And quite frankly, this is how we ended up where we're at now, where we get somebody that's a celebrity or a superstar in the church, preach a mixture gospel, but because he has influence or personality or something like that, everybody goes along with it just because this particular man of God says so, and there's not this emphasis and focus on what he's preaching versus who he is. So I think that's wisdom that we can apply to today. Verse 8. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need." Of course, we know in the King James Version it says, my grace is sufficient. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, I am strong. So I want to first zero in on this word sufficient, because this phrase is so popular, not only in the church, but even the world. This is one of those things where everybody knows this verse or this phrase, and it turns into a cliche, and we completely miss or overlook what the meaning is. So the Thayer definition. So first, let's just say that if you want to apply this word in the right context, can mean his grace is enough. I would say that's how it would be a synonym for sufficient. But in this context, the Thayer definition, I think, gives a more precise definition of it. First, to lift up a barrier, to ward off, to defend against. Second definition would be to be possessed of unfailing strength, to be strong, to suffice, to be enough against any danger. So when Jesus is saying to Paul, my grace is sufficient for thee, he's saying my grace will be a wall or a barrier against whatever is coming against you. So in order to interpret this properly, I think you need to fit in this Thayer definition that needs to be applied to this word versus just saying, my grace is enough. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. So something else here in verse 9 that I think gets overlooked. So when Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for thee, my power works best in weakness. And the King James power there is strength, but it's actually the Greek word dunamis, so it should be translated as power. And the thorough definition for dunamis is God's miraculous power. So what you see is Jesus equating his miraculous power with his grace. And he's essentially telling Paul that my grace is the answer to anything and everything. That's what, you try to put grace in this bottle, into this box, and grace is everything. Because let me say it like this. So Jesus is God, and Jesus is grace personified. So when we look at it that way, when God says my grace is sufficient for thee, he's saying that grace is the supernatural substance of God. Meaning that this grace has the ability to transform our circumstances, our lives, and our behavior. It's the answer to everything. When we draw on grace, we're drawing on the supernatural power of God. The best way to demonstrate this, the Old Covenant witness, going back to Abraham. Anytime you come on here, I'm going to be always putting focus and emphasis on Abraham. God preached the gospel to Abraham. Moses at one time was Moses and the 10 Commandments and the law at one time, that was the present truth. But when we look back in the Old Covenant and we're trying to see these pictures and this understanding of this grace, the story of Abraham, there's a lot of revelation and understanding that is overlooked. And I think it's because of that mixture gospel that we preach and teach, overlooks the details and the spiritual minerals and nutrients in the story of Abraham. So Genesis 15, God preaches the gospel to Abraham. Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed God and was accounted to him for righteousness. Genesis 16, we have the story of Hagar. So what we're seeing in Hagar is Abraham attempting to attain the promise in his own strength. And it failed miserably and it went really bad. Genesis 17, this is when all the action starts. Genesis 17 is when God changes the names from Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. And the difference is the impartation of his grace. Talked about this before. When you look at the difference between those names, the only difference between Sarai and Sarah is this exchange from one letter in Hebrew is from one letter to another letter. And that the fifth letter, Hey, was put into Sarai's name, which made it Sarah, and his grace. Same thing in Abraham. We see the impartation of grace. So when you look at Genesis 17 and you see this power of grace imparted into their lives by faith. So every time Sarah said, my name is Sarah, she was saying, I am the mother of many nations because of his grace. When we see this impartation of grace in Genesis 17, let's take a close look at everything that happens in their lives after that point. Genesis 18, God promises Abraham and Sarah the promise that the promised son, the son is promised to them in Genesis 18. So what is Genesis 18 telling us? What you cannot do in your own strength, God's grace can do it for you. Genesis 19:29 tells us, and it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. God's grace will protect your family. Genesis chapter 20, God rescues Abraham from himself. This is the chapter when Abraham gives his wife to another man, Abimelech, and tells Abimelech he can have his way with his wife. God intervenes and goes to Abimelech and says, this woman belongs to that man. That's his wife, not his sister. So give her back. If not, he's a prophet. He'll pray for you. If not, you'll die. So Abimelech gives his wife back to Abraham. But it's interesting that this is sin. Abraham, this is the second time he's done this. He's done this twice, where he's lying about Sarah being his wife, being his sister and not his wife, even though that is some partial truth there, but he's lying to deceive people. And then offering his wife to other men. We don't even have to explain that one. But God never confronts Abraham about it. He never rebukes him. He never judges him, doesn't condemn him, doesn't punish him. If anything, God goes behind the scenes and spins that thing around. Why do we say all things work together for your good, but then don't really believe it? We say all things work together for your good, except for when you sin. But when we see this here, Abraham sins, and then God goes and spins that things around in his favor. Because when you look down at the end of the chapter here, it says Abimelech gave him oxen and cattle and gave him silver. So this is a demonstration of the wealth transfer. And then this is also the chapter where we have the first reference of prayer. So Abraham prays for Abimelech, and then everybody starts getting pregnant and starts having babies. So this tells me in Genesis 20 that in spite of his sin, wealth transfer, healing, fruitfulness, these things are in plain sight. But when you if you don't look at the scriptures the right way, you won't see this. Genesis 21, Sarah conceives and gives birth to the promise, gives birth to Isaac. Simple picture here of grace will make your dreams come true. But there's something else here too in Genesis 21. I'm going to close after this one. This is also the chapter where Hagar gets kicked out of the house. So there's something spiritual going on here, and there's something in the natural too at the same time. Double meaning here. We know that Sarah represents grace. Hagar represents the law. So first, this is telling us that the law and grace cannot be mingled together. They can't coexist together. So law had to be removed. It's powerful right there in itself. But there's also something natural here in the natural too. And I think this could really help someone. That when I see this picture here, we all know the story, Hagar, Sarah, he gets Hagar pregnant, and that caused a lot of problems. But Hagar being removed here tells us that if you are in a relationship, a sexual relationship, an illegal sexual relationship, so you're under some kind of sexual relationship and you're stuck and you can't get out, this is telling me that the power of grace can remove you from a relationship that you shouldn't be in, specifically a sexual relationship. The power of God's grace can take someone that's in your life that should not be in your life. There could be some kind of stronghold or something there, and that person can be removed out of your life by the power of God's grace. That's just a picture there. And with some of the ministries, with some of the preaching that I follow, that's a consistent testimony of people that are having sexual issues, sexual relationships that they can't get out of, they feel like they're stuck in, and there's something about this grace that removes people out of your life. And I'm not talking about nobody being killed or nothing like that. I'm just saying that like circumstances and situations, someone will be removed out of your life when this power of grace is working in your life and imparted in your life. I could go on with more chapters, but I really wanted to hit verse 20. And so I think I'm just going to close this here. His grace is sufficient. And once again, this is, episode number 50. So we're going to keep this going. And we all just going to keep growing in grace and the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Zechariah 4:7, grace.
Spirit Life Ministries International will be having a Grace Conference, November 17th to 18th. Located at 3401 Governor Prince Boulevard, Wilmington, Delaware, 7 p.m. nightly. Speakers will be Pastor Kenneth E. Gaines and Brother Paul Noble Jr. Mask will be required in the sanctuary and temperature check upon entry to the building. Please come out and hear a word from the Lord.